Late October. This is really my favorite time of year. Apple cider shows up in the grocery store, trees turn into a kaleidoscope of colors you forgot even existed for 10 months, and the temperature is just right for walking around outside in a windbreaker without having anything much to do besides think and take in the world. Oh, and also Halloween. I love Halloween because it's a holiday that's not so much about being scared as about the idea of scariness. Just as there are all kinds of ways you can get freaked out at any time of year, usually in a way that has nothing to do with carved pumpkins or people in devil costumes, it's also true that the iconography of Halloween exists as much for the sake of having a good time as it does to be scary. Horror stories, good ones at least, rely a lot on the element of surprise, and the fact is that most Halloween imagery is so familiar that it has no shock value at all. Ghosts, black cats, jack-o'-lanterns, stock monster types like vampires and witches, these are all things that can freak out little kids. But I think that for most adults, this stuff is actually comforting. Maybe because we tend to look back on scary childhood moments with a kind of nostalgia. When it comes to works of fiction that are legitimately trying to get a rise out of you, this cheesiness can be a real liability. I mentioned in a video a few years ago that lots of modern horror movies and games aren't very effective at selling the atmosphere because they lean too much on stale horror cliches that don't work anymore. But if your real objective is just to have fun with it, outdated horror cliches can actually be an asset, because people don't necessarily expect humor and horror to go together, and because the older-than-dirt status of these tropes is itself amusing. It's like I always say, when the bread is stale, you make French toast. And no video game franchise makes my particular kind of French toast quite like Castlevania, specifically the Metroidvania style entries between Symphony of the Night in 1997 and Order of Ecclesia in 2008. Before the series went in a very grim dark direction with 2010's Lords of Shadow and its sequels, and then kind of keeled over and died. But that's a story for another video. What I especially love about these 7 games is their flair for mixing the above-mentioned goofy, half-serious, spooky elements with others that retain all the freshness and punch of straight-up horror. If you're looking to be scared, these games will surprise you by being funny so often. But if you expect them to be one big joke from beginning to end, the horror can really sneak up on you and send a serious chill down your spine. So for this spooky season, I'm going to be whipping up a special brew for all of you. A ranking of the Metroidvanias by scariness, from the most innocuously inane to the most uncompromisingly unnerving. But before I jump right into that, let's lay down some ground rules. First of all, I'm going to be considering 2 things primarily in judging how scary each game is. The inherent or theoretical scariness of the ideas which they present, which includes story elements, enemy design, background details, and so on, and how effectively the ideas come across through the game's presentation. For example, if we were to judge these games purely by the presence of creepy stuff and the absence of whimsy or humor, Circle of the Moon would unquestionably be near the top of the list. This is a very grim game with some truly grotesque enemies and virtually no comic relief at all. However, this is also a game that came out so early in the GBA's lifespan that it looks and sounds virtually identical to a Game Boy Color game. And that very simple presentation makes it hard for the game to really hook you and force you to take its story seriously. Not to mention the fact that it has barely any story to take seriously in the first place. My goal here isn't to come up with a theoretical idea of how scary these games should be. It's to judge how scared someone would actually be playing them, obviously based largely on my personal experience with each. I'm not going to pretend that there's anything scientific about this ranking. Fear is not an objective phenomenon, and analyzing it is far more of a fiddly art than a strict science. Also, and I know this might be a little disappointing, I'm not going to be including Symphony of the Night, the progenitor of the whole Metroidvania line, in this ranking. It's not that I don't think it's scary, or worth studying. If anything, the opposite is true. Symphony of the Night demands so much scrutiny that if I tackled it here and now, it would probably take up half the video. Comparing the later Metroidvanias with the game that inspired them would also be a bit of an unfair comparison on both sides. On the one hand, Symphony of the Night has a lot of advantages in the atmosphere department which they mostly don't. It's the only one that wasn't designed for a portable video game console, which allowed it to have more detailed graphics, better and more natural-sounding music, and smoother gameplay than pretty much all of its successors, with maybe a slight exception in the case of Order of Ecclesia. And then, on the other hand, in a lot of ways, Symphony of the Night is also so corny that I doubt it could outcompete any of the portable Metroidvanias in terms of setting a consistently scary tone. This is the only game of the bunch to have voice acting for most of its cutscenes, almost all of which is hilariously terrible, and it rivals Simon's Quest in the bizarreness of its translated dialogue. While the game at its creepiest can really send a shiver up your back, it's so prone to wrecking that scary impression with goofy nonsense that I'm honestly not sure I would know where to put it on this list if I did include it. So that leaves us with 6 games for our ranking, released over a period of just 7 years. For the Game Boy Advance, we have Circle of the Moon in 2001, Harmony of Dissonance in 2002, and Aria of Sorrow in 2003. And then, for the Nintendo DS, Dawn of Sorrow in 2005, Portrait of Ruin in 2006, and Order of Ecclesia in 2008. You can expect spoilers for all of these games over the rest of this video, by the way. Just thought I'd mention that. Alright then, let's get spooky. Or not, I guess, since we're starting with the silliest one first. So right off the bat, we have a textbook example of how scary is not the same as good when it comes to Castlevania games. This is actually close to my favorite of the Metroidvanias, and one that I have bucket loads of childhood nostalgia for. It's the second Castlevania game I ever played, as well as one of the first video games I ever bought with my own money. Portrait of Ruin is one of few games that I enjoy practically from beginning to end, no matter how many times I play it. But boy is it silly. In Portrait of Ruin, you play as a duo of would-be vampire hunters with no direct connection to the Belmont clan. Jonathan Morris, who possesses the legendary vampire killer but must prove himself in order to safely wield it, and Charlotte Olin, a sorceress sent by the church to assist him. The story is set in Europe during World War II. Not that this has much to do with the plot, other than the main villain's motivation involving something that happened during World War I. Speaking of which, the main villain in this game is not actually Dracula, but another vampire named Browner, who has taken control of his castle through some vague process involving the creation of magical paintings with alternate worlds inside them, like some weird mashup of Myst and that Vincent van Gogh scene from Kurosawa's Dreams. This is already a pretty outlandish premise for a Castlevania game, the kind of thing you'd be more likely to find in an early 3D platformer like Banjo-Kazooie, but that's not the reason Portrait of Ruin is scraping the bottom of the list. What really separates it from its Metroidvania compatriots is the tone, which in this case is silly probably more often than it is properly scary. There's no comic relief in Portrait of Ruin, because the game goofs around so much that it's actually a bit of a relief when it stops. Just to make the point, let me take you on a brief tour of a few things you run across in the very first painting world, a faux Victorian town center called the City of Haze. An anthropomorphic crow riding on a giant armored dog. A skeletal bartender who attacks by mixing cocktails and then sliding them at you across the bar. A secret bakery where you can buy a slice of cake by attacking the cash register and then breaking a chandelier so it drops a coin inside. Enormous flying jellyfish. A butcher's shop that you can go into and punch raw meat with your bare hands like in Rocky. This is actually required to complete one of the side quests, by the way. And a middle-aged man with a goofy hat who, if you're playing as Charlotte, will get down on one knee and propose to her, and then if you walk away will cry, "Don't reject me!" You can encounter all of these things over a span of about 5 minutes in the same level. And this level is by no means the weirdest part of Portrait of Ruin. 2 of the game's worlds are circuses in which both the level geometry and the enemies observe non-Newtonian rules of gravity. Several of the bosses from later levels are the villains from classic 1930s monster movies. One of the earlier bosses is essentially a cauldron full of green goo. Another one can put a love spell on Jonathan that will make him attack Charlotte, and then if you defeat him as Charlotte, you get a special cutscene afterwards where she goes ballistic on him for being so stupid. And I have to say, I love every minute of this absurdity. I would seriously recommend this game to people purely on the basis of how weird it is. Portrait of Ruin is almost never scary, and in fact it goes so far around the bend that even when it's a little scary, I can't get scared, because I'm still thinking about some doofy thing the game did 5 minutes ago. Do not go into this game expecting straightforward horror, because you will not get it. And what you do get is kind of better. Well, different at any rate. Dawn of Sorrow, the initials of which spell out DS, as in the Nintendo DS, in case you didn't notice that tidbit of cleverness, was a transitional game for the series. It was the first Castlevania game on the DS, which meant it included a lot of half-baked touchscreen usage, but it was also a direct sequel to Aria of Sorrow on the GBA, and built considerably on that game's unique tactical soul magic system. You see, a particularly interesting quirk of the 2 Sorrow games is that in them you play as Soma Cruz, a Japanese high school student who somehow inherited Dracula's power of dominance, which allowed him to control the monstrous inhabitants of his castle. In Soma's case, this expresses itself as the ability to acquire and use the souls of enemies to launch magical attacks, increase attributes like strength or luck, and do all kinds of weird stuff, some of which is mandatory to progress. It's central to both the combat and the Metroidvania-style exploration of these 2 games, and it makes them feel quite similar to each other and distinct from the rest of the series. But there are other reasons why Dawn of Sorrow felt like a departure from previous Castlevania entries, and a lot of them have to do with aesthetics and atmosphere. This was the first game since Symphony of the Night to not make use of the talents of artist Ayami Kojima, whose expressive, watercolory style is instantly recognizable to fans of the GBA Metroidvanias, in much the same way that early Final Fantasy games were defined by the artwork of Yoshitaka Amano. Dawn of Sorrow's art, on the other hand, was turned over to... well, actually, this is sort of the point. No one, outside of Konami at least, actually knows who's responsible for the look of this game. The credits include a player designer and 2 enemy designers, but they don't list a single artist except for Kojima, who's credited only for originally drawing the characters in the previous game. And from the art, honestly, you can kinda see why. Dawn of Sorrow has a much more generic and anime-oriented approach to its design, which causes it to feel less unique than its predecessor, as well as less scary. Like Symphony of the Night, Dawn of Sorrow has a fair number of scary moments, in particular some of the boss battles, like Gurgoth, but both its art style and the presence of a lot of friendly NPCs who you're encouraged to visit over and over again really get in the way of a proper scare. What does manage to sell the atmosphere quite a bit in Dawn of Sorrow is the soundtrack. This is some of the catchiest music in the series, and it's often quite creepy as well, which helps to put you on edge when the level design doesn't quite manage that on its own. Not that the level design is always a flop, though. In fact, there's one level of Dawn of Sorrow that really gets my heart racing, and to make things even better, it's the last one. The Abyss, a literal descent into hell which features some of the most elaborate and freakish visuals in the entire Castlevania series. It's hard for me to describe exactly what it is that makes me love this area so much. It's just so out there. Every section is visually distinct, and yet they all feel, well, hellish. I especially like this part, which always makes me think of those weird Escher-esque album covers that Blue Oyster Cult used to have back in the 70s. So cool. So yeah, in case it isn't obvious, this is also a game I'm really nostalgic for, despite the fact that it isn't that scary most of the time. I mentioned earlier that Portrait of Ruin was the second Castlevania game I ever played. Well, this was the first one, and the one that sold me on the entire franchise. In fact, when you think about it, you could argue that I owe most of the scares that Castlevania has given me over the years to this game. So thanks, Dawn of Sorrow. I'm sorry I had to put you so low on this list. Harmony of Dissonance was the second of the GBA Metroidvanias, and even though it only came out a year after Circle of the Moon, there's a world of difference between the two games aesthetically. Circle of the Moon was downright simplistic, with an art style that more than anything else resembled the original NES Castlevania, while this game, not to oversell it or anything, but it's kind of beautiful, despite how garish and gross everything looks. The resolution here is pretty low, but when you're viewing it on the small screen, these visuals are intense, and your brain kind of fills in the details that are often just hinted at by the 16-bit-ish graphics. It's amazing how much effort the artists put into recreating things like stained glass windows and clouds zooming through the sky on a system that's barely capable of even making them recognizable. A noble effort? Or a wasted effort? It's difficult to say. Obviously, none of this looks realistic. It doesn't even get as far in that department as Symphony of the Night, a game that Harmony of Dissonance copies much more closely than any other Metroidvania. And yet this combination of minute detail and chunky graphics is absorbing and immersive in its own way, like illustrations in an old picture book that evoke an imaginary world in your head rather than accurately portraying the real one. It's a neat effect. So why am I putting it below the other two GBA games? Because of everything that isn't the artwork. The music, for instance, is, interesting. I like it, but there's a lot of people who don't, and it's not that they think it's scary, they just think it's bad. The harsh, scratchy sound fonts and atonal melodies exist in this uncanny valley where they're weird enough to be off-putting, but not enough to be scary. Plus, and I realize this is kind of subjective, the game is really easy to cheese your way through. It has the same problem as Symphony of the Night, which is that the low level of challenge just doesn't fit with the dark aesthetic. At least the dialogue in this game isn't hilariously bad, but at the same time there's just not much going on in the story department, and that makes it hard to care about Juiced and get scared when bad things happen to him. More than any other Metroidvania, Harmony of Dissonance strikes me as a bunch of interesting visuals and cool boss encounters stretched over a kind of thin and anemic core experience. It's fun, and it rewards exploration really well, but there's nothing here to keep you engaged on an emotional level. Even Alucard came across as more of a fleshed-out character than Juiced does. Maxim's pretty cool, though. So here we are at the very first portable Metroidvania ever. This game is more than 20 years old, and I'd be lying if I said it doesn't look its age. It's undeniably the worst looking of the six. Not that the graphics look bad necessarily, the other games are just better. And it's structurally old-fashioned too, with a progression path that's almost as strict as Super Metroid's, unlike the more open-ended style of Symphony of the Night. Actually, Circle of the Moon goes beyond strict, well into the realm of unforgiving. This is a truly challenging game that demands a lot of careful planning, skillful execution, and often a stroke of luck to get past its harder sections. Optional upgrades are scattered all over the place, which is cool, but honestly I'd hesitate to even call them optional, because in my experience you need about 80% of these to stay on top of what the game throws at you. I'm not joking around here. This game is hard, so much so that I don't even remember whether I've beaten it or not. I know I've made it to the final boss, but every time I think about that boss, my mind goes a little bit blank, and I start having premonitions of impending doom. Yeah, that is not a fun time, that boss. You have to remember here that when I judge a game's scariness, the feeling of playing the game is part of that judgment. And I've never played a Castlevania game that made me so nervous about going on as this one. Sure, the graphics are no great shakes, but unlike in Harmony of Dissonance, everything here, the visuals, the music, the difficulty, and the enemy design, fits together extremely well to create a unified impression of terror. That's why I consider it the scarier game of the two. Although to be honest, these games have kind of a Neptune-Pluto relationship to me, where I find one or the other scarier depending on when you ask me. Circle of the Moon is one of the few Metroidvanias that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everybody. If you're looking for a serious challenge, this is one of relatively few to fit that bill, but if what you're looking for is simple fun and a few laughs, I'd tell you to stay far away. You have to meet this game on its own terms, and those terms are that you will take this vampire game seriously or die. In the game, not in real life. Although that final boss could definitely give you a few heart murmurs. You might be wondering at this point what the last of the GBA Metroidvanias could possibly have that makes it scarier than either Harmony of Dissonance with its grotesque art design, or Circle of the Moon with its forbidding difficulty. And frankly, when you stack this game up to those two on the basis of their best points, it ends up being the loser. I love the art in this game, especially the characters and the enemy design, but it's not as grotesque or frightening as the flat-out weird stuff you'll see in Harmony of Dissonance. And while Aria of Sorrow is more challenging than its immediate predecessor, Circle of the Moon kicks both of their asses at that particular type of scare. But Aria of Sorrow has a trick up its sleeve that these other two games don't. A legitimately scary story that abandons the typical Castlevania cliches in favor of something a little more thought-provoking. The stories of Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance are pretty generic, and also quite similar to each other. Both involve a quest to rescue someone from Dracula's castle, defeating a minion who's trying to revive Dracula, and a shonen-esque rivalry between two male protagonists, which culminates in one of them being possessed by Dracula. I think it's also worth noting that both of these stories have an obvious debt to Symphony of the Night, which came out nearly half a decade earlier. In that game, Alucard has to save Richter from Dracula's castle. Death is trying to revive Dracula. Harmony of Dissonance copies this part verbatim, incidentally. And oh, guess what? Richter is possessed by Dracula, and Alucard has to fight him. In Aria of Sorrow, on the other hand, Dracula is dead at the beginning of the game, and he stays dead. There's no obvious hand-rubbing henchman scheming to bring him back, no played-out rivalry subplot or characters getting possessed out of nowhere. Instead, Aria of Sorrow focuses on the aftermath of Dracula's downfall, especially on what happens to the people who fought him, and those who have the ability to inherit his dark powers. The protagonist, Soma Cruz, is one of these people, as is the main villain for most of the game, Graham Jones, and neither of these characters is a simple stereotype. Jones is actually quite friendly and polite when he and Soma first meet. As the presumed lord of the manor, he thinks he can afford to be magnanimous. It's only later, when Soma has discovered that he has similar powers to Jones, that a real conflict emerges between the two, and Jones turns hostile and violent. Another intriguing plot detail involves a mysterious man who lost his memory years ago, and thus refers to himself only as Jay. When Soma runs across him, he's searching for traces of the battle that once took place there, convinced that they hold the key to reclaiming his identity. And as you later discover, this is true. Jay is actually Julius Belmont, the man who slew Dracula 36 years before the events of the game, and was stricken with amnesia as a result. The interaction of these three characters gives Aria of Sorrow one of the coolest and most gripping climaxes that any Castlevania game has ever had. I don't want to spoil it too much, so I'll just say that it essentially boils down to the fact that each character gradually comes to learn who he truly is, and this knowledge profoundly changes their feelings about each other, as well as their roles in the power struggle that defines the story. It's not all that complicated, and it certainly doesn't get bogged down by philosophy, but this is still one of my favorite stories in video game history. It's full of shocking surprises without sacrificing consistency of tone or believability, and it has what I consider to be the best cast of characters in the whole Castlevania series. However, it is not the scariest game in the series. That honor belongs to... How fitting. The last entry on our list is also the last of these games to come out, and arguably the last proper Castlevania game ever. In Order of Ecclesia, you play as Shinoa, a young woman who belongs to a secret society called, you guessed it, Ecclesia, dedicated to protecting the world from Dracula's evil influence. Under the direction of the organization's leader Barlow, a man who practically raised her from an early age, she sets out to recover a set of magical glyphs with the power to destroy Dracula's remains. These glyphs were stolen by Barlow's one-time apprentice, Albus, who appears to have been driven by a lust for power to betray everything he once stood for. In pursuit of Albus, Shinoa travels across a huge world map filled with bizarre environments, monstrous creatures, and numerous people who've been kidnapped by Albus for unclear reasons, the only real clue being that all of them were living in the same small village before being abducted. These villagers give you some rare moments of comic relief, as well as side quests that you can complete to gain special items, some of which are very helpful in getting through the more combat-focused areas. And believe me, you can use the help. The most infamous aspect of Order of Ecclesia is its super high level of difficulty, which sets it apart from every other Metroidvania in the series, except for Circle of the Moon. And anyway, it's so different from Circle of the Moon in other ways that I've never seen anyone directly compare the two. Everything about Order of Ecclesia comes across as a bit unusual to anybody who's familiar with the elements of classic Metroidvanias. Instead of having physical weapons and magical skills that supplement them, in this game you use glyphs to fight enemies, and they all use up your magic bar. Although to compensate for this, the bar refills itself in just a few seconds when you stop attacking. The game world, instead of being one large interconnected castle, is now made up of separate levels that appear in a fairly linear fashion, although you'll often backtrack to previous areas to explore new sections of their maps, giving Order of Ecclesia a feel somewhere between Portrait of Ruin with its painting worlds and the older Castlevania games with distinct linear stages. NPCs no longer appear all over the map, but stay in the main village once you've rescued them, giving it a hub-like quality and making character interactions more of an optional thing. In fact, when it comes to characters, this is one of the more streamlined Metroidvanias. Almost all major story developments involve only Shinoa, Barlow, and Albus, with the villagers acting more as a plot point than as actual participants in the plot. The rule of three is central to Order of Ecclesia in a lot of ways. There are three main characters, the Dominus glyph has 3 parts, most glyphs have 3 levels of strength, and when Dracula's castle finally appears, you must defeat 3 sub-bosses to make your way to the top. Some of you out there may mistakenly believe that there are 4 sub-bosses in the castle. Presumably this is because you think Wallman counts as a boss. He does not. Wallman is not a boss, he is a practical joke with a health bar. Anyway, the way I look at it, the scariness of this game also comes down to 3 essential elements: the visual design, the challenge, and the story. And when you look at the way it prioritizes these 3 things, many aspects of the game's design make more sense than they do if you think of Order of Ecclesia as just another Metroidvania. The decision to break up the map into many separate, isolated areas, for instance, was a terrible idea if what you want is the typical Metroidvania hook of upgrade-based open exploration. It simultaneously makes the map too big and complicated for the player to easily keep track of where to return to for optional upgrades, and too small in the case of each individual area to give the player any real choice in how they get from point A to point B. You can tell that the team was a little wary about changing this, because for a large chunk of the game leading up to the ending, you traverse a new version of Dracula's castle, which does feature the series' trademark open-ended exploration, just on a smaller scale than usual. And while a lot of reviewers cited the high difficulty as a reason for disliking the game, it seems to me that it's this change which most clearly sets Order of Ecclesia apart from its predecessors, and would be most likely to displease the older fans. But there are some advantages to this design, and the biggest one, in my opinion, is aesthetic. Now that most of the game takes place outside Dracula's castle, the environments can be so much more varied and visually interesting. The levels can be set in all kinds of places: in a gloomy forest, on top of a mountain surrounded by sheer cliffs, among the rock formations of an underwater reef, inside caverns and along tree-lined roads, really just about anywhere. Let's be frank for a second here. Having a series of games that always have to be set inside a giant castle is really claustrophobic in terms of level design. If the team took a basic, down-to-earth approach to that premise, the result would be really dull. And to avoid that, they do a lot of, well, let's call it what it is: cheating. Harmony of Dissonance has the gimmick of a separate castle based on Maxim's mind, so that it can throw weird-ass psychedelic backgrounds at you. Portrait of Ruin introduces magical paintings into the series out of nowhere, so that you can fool around in an ancient pyramid in a topsy-turvy circus, while still technically staying inside the building. Both Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow feature areas that no self-respecting aristocrat would ever choose to include in his design plans, and even Symphony of the Night strains credulity with some of its places. I mean, really, who would build not one, but 2 Roman-style amphitheaters inside his house just so intruders could have a spooky place to fight werewolves in? So not only are the visuals in this game beautiful, but they also keep you immersed in the experience more because they don't have to be shoehorned into a setting where they don't belong. And the character art is, if anything, even better. This is the first game in the series since Aria of Sorrow to have a known lead artist, Masaki Hirooka, whose designs make these characters distinctive and convey a lot of personality. The difficulty is another area where you can see the designer's thought process at work. There's no question that Order of Ecclesia's difficulty is a noticeable jump up from the series standard, and that can be off-putting to a lot of people. It doesn't help that its immediate predecessor, Portrait of Ruin, was one of the easiest and least scary Castlevania games ever, and that was the baseline that people were expecting going into Order of Ecclesia. 2008 may not seem like that long ago, but it was 3 years before Dark Souls came along and made it cool for a game to be unforgivingly hard again. Not that Order of Ecclesia is all that hard when you get right down to it. I managed to beat it, and I'm a total wuss. I've never even made it past Hyda's Tower of Flame in Dark Souls 2. From what I can remember of Koji Igarashi's statements at the time, their idea was to bring back the Nintendo hard feeling of the franchise's early days, while preserving the charm of the Metroidvania format. But honestly, they chickened out on that front. The original Castlevania is still one of the hardest and most unforgiving Castlevania games ever made, and Order of Ecclesia isn't anywhere close to that hard. What it is just hard enough to make you apprehensive, and keep you from settling into a comfortable, repetitive gameplay style. I don't know if this is what the team was going for, but to me the main advantage of the game being so hard is that it forces you to pay attention. Dying over and over again is something that tends to break immersion and take you out of the experience. But if you're actually learning and not just banging your head against the wall, you really shouldn't be dying that much. Finally, we have the story, which I've already touched on a bit. Scary wouldn't actually be the first word that springs to my mind in describing Order of Ecclesia's story. Somber is probably closer to it, but along with that there's this eerie otherworldliness, a slow burn of scariness that sticks at the back of your mind as you play. It's subtle enough that I can see people disagreeing with me about this being the scariest game in the series, but still, isn't subtlety what good horror is all about? I mean, look at the original Resident Evil versus the original Silent Hill. On the one hand, you have a game that's super campy and in your face with the scares. And then on the other, you have a game that starts out being just bizarre and unsettling, and slowly, patiently building up from there, until by the end, the world's gone completely mad. You could say Resident Evil is the scarier of the two just because it's more startling and it makes your heart jump. But isn't Silent Hill, I don't know, better about how it's scary? That's what Order of Ecclesia is. Maybe it's not actually the scariest of these games on a visceral level, but it's the game whose scares are the highest quality, if that makes sense. But then again, given how poorly it sold, and the fact that the whole franchise ended just half a decade later, I guess it doesn't make that much sense to most people. Even though this whole video has been about how scary the various Metroidvanias have been, I've mentioned before that what really attracts me to the franchise is its other qualities. What I find most endearing about these games is not so much that they're scary, or how much they're scary, but rather what they combine with the horror elements to evoke a new, unique feeling. Harmony of Dissonance is scary and outlandishly grotesque. Order of Ecclesia is scary and pulls on your heartstrings. Aria of Sorrow is scary and mysterious. Portrait of Ruin is scary and also not really scary. I don't often hear people calling these games samey, even though they mostly adhere to a fairly similar action-adventure formula. And I think the reason for that is that each game has its own distinctive atmosphere that makes it feel special. I hope I've managed to communicate a bit of that special quality here. But the truth is that to really appreciate these games, you have to play them and find out for yourself. I chose to rank these games by scariness and not by overall quality for a good reason. No one agrees on the quality of any of these games. I've heard people making a case for every single one being the best Metroidvania in the series. And that just goes to show how unique each one is, so that different players will fall in love with a different game depending on what they look for in a game. Your favorite Castlevania game says as much about you as, say, your choice of Halloween costume. Some are super authentic and richly detailed. Others are deliberately exaggerated to have a more startling effect on the viewer. And then there are some that are just silly and over the top, because who actually wants to be scary on Halloween, am I right? It makes me sad to think that there won't be any new additions to this motley crew, but at the same time there's so much in this series to reward diving back in every now and then. Castlevania may be a dead franchise, but just like Dracula in the year 2035, its memory lives on to inspire and energize the horror-themed games of the future. You can get too old for trick-or-treating. You can get too old for gorging yourself on candy. Heck, maybe you can even get too old to party in a silly outfit. But you're never too old to boot up an old Metroidvania and get a good old-fashioned scare, just like Koji used to make. So happy Halloween, everybody. Have yourselves a good night, and don't let the vampires bite. Unless you're into that sort of thing, in which case, go ahead. I don't care, I'm not your dad. Or am I?